The second part of this intro lecture is about application areas, so fields in which you can, in principle, apply brain-computer interfaces and specific examples of applications. And all of these applications, by the way, have been done in the literature or have been tried. Although in many cases, there's always still some residual performance that we have not yet achieved or squeezed out, if you will. So in many cases, things can be sort of done, but the BCI in many cases doesn't work well enough yet to be really a killer application or practically useful for healthy people to convince them to buy a headset. So I'll go through some of these things. The traditional use case for BCIs has been as I said, clinical populations like severely disabled people. And there's two conditions specifically. One is the locked-in syndrome, which is also known as ALS, where a person is essentially unable to move any limb due to a neurological disorder. And so they become increasingly locked into their own body and are completely unable to move at an end stage. And so for these people, it is critical that they are able to communicate. That's the number one priority, in fact, even before mobility. And another condition is tetraplegia, where just all your limbs are basically unusable for whatever reason, brainstem, stroke, and things like that. And so for these people, the first applications were speller programs, so they can write an email or talk to their caregiver and things like that. Like this one, which is called the P3 speller, where rows and columns of this flash, and it gives you a brain response, and that is what the BCI picks up. So this is a reactive BCI. Or this kind of speller where you're sort of, by imagining movements, rotating this arrow and selecting letters. So that's actually an active BCI in that case. There's more uses for these kinds of populations. Another is mobility, as I said, so being able to control a wheelchair or control a robotic hand and so on. And the third one is being able to manipulate the environment, such as turn on the light and stuff like that. And that's basically the three big areas for clinical populations. And more recently, we've entered the era where BCIs are being utilized for healthy populations. So that's for commercial purposes or workplace purposes. And here are a few driver scenarios. So here's one study where people studied the braking intent. So a person's going to hit the brake. The brain generates a discernible signal quite some time before before your foot moves. And so if you can detect this reliably, you can save a couple meters of on the road. Although the accuracy isn't yet quite at the point where this doesn't have false positives, which is a huge issue, of course. Or there are other things like lane change intent or workload and fatigue, which is really critical for truck drivers who are on the road for 6 hours plus. So this is in fact a real-world application that has been looked at for 4 or 5 years now. Another related area is people who operate really complex systems with lots of information where you tend to fail to notice certain events. And so you want to know, has the person seen this flash of light, and has the person, whatever, recognized that kind of thing? Is a person fatigued, etc.? And so here's an application of actually people who use our toolbox for that kind of study. So that things like air traffic controllers, people who operate plants, and so on. And these are all passive BCIs, as you can imagine, because people are doing some task, and then there's layered on top this extra information, which tells the guy next door that he's at high load or that he's falling asleep or things like that. Here's another application in law enforcement and things like that, in forensics. So there the idea is, has this person already seen this knife or not? And depending on the response, that gives you a bit of information on whether he might be basically the murderer or something like that. Although this is, of course, highly problematic if you're working with uncertain signals and so on. But that's just, you basically have the same kind of problem with many ways of acquiring evidence, of course. Looking at some other areas, there's of course gaming, and this is one of the areas where BCIs were first to market among all BCIs for healthy populations. So there's now headsets like this Neuroscience mindset, which give you some measure of relaxation maybe, or some measure of focus, they call it. Although these things, I mean, you know, there's still a long way to go until they work really well. But people buy these, you can buy these things today. By the way, this has only one electrode. That gives you actually a very, very bad signal if you want to do some serious cognitive state assessment. Here's another one, you know, a Jedi type Force game and so on. And there's a couple more. There's another commercial area, and that's personal health and so on. Things like sleep stage monitoring to improve your sleep quality, or rehabilitation, neurorehabilitation, brain training, neurofeedback, and these kinds of things, which allow you to, by yourself with some kind of a device, you know, utilize brain signals in cognitive state assessment. And here's another social application. You know, these cat ears tilt based on your mood in some sense, though it's not clear if they really, you know, if they use anything other than these muscles which end here related to smiling. But anyway, and then there is a whole other area, and this is in a sense where it all started, and that's neuroscience. You can use brain-computer interfaces and the technology underneath brain-computer interfaces to do things like brain imaging, to find patterns in brain dynamics that relate to a parameter of interest, like your workload level or so, and thereby learn something about brain dynamics in some way. This is called multivariate pattern analysis in other fields. It's pretty much the same algorithms in many cases, or just slight reformulations. So that's one area. And there's another area also in neuroscience, which is closed-loop neuroscience experiments, where the idea is BCIs give you a parameter that depends on your brain state, and you can use it in real time. And so you can have experiments where a manipulation in the experiment depends on the person's brain state or cognitive state. And so you can do kinds of experiments that really haven't been possible before. This is something that's rather new, only a few years now, 2 or so, when people started doing these kinds of things. And that takes us to the end of this module.